Atlantis. The moment you hear it, something stirs, not memory exactly, but something older than memory, a feeling, a pull, a silence that seems to remember itself. The name itself echoes. It doesn't land like other words. It lingers, it hums, not as history, but as resonance. Because Atlantis was never just a place, it was a state, a pattern, a song the soul once knew and forgot how to sing. When Plato first whispered of it, he wasn't inventing, he was remembering, or perhaps he was translating something that cannot be told, only felt. And so, the world has chased Atlantis through oceans, through ruins, through maps that shift and fade. But perhaps we've been looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps Atlantis is not beneath the sea, but beneath the surface of us. A forgotten room in the temple of the self, a sacred architecture buried not in sand, but in silence. That is why the myths remain. That is why the name returns. Not to tell us where Atlantis was, but to remind us what we've lost. Or more precisely, what we once were. It calls to something deep within, a knowing beyond proof, a homesickness with no location. Atlantis. It is not the name of a city, it is a key, a vibration, a door we once walked through and left behind when we chose to forget. But the door still exists, and the key still fits, because the name was never just a name. It was a signal, and it is calling you back. We were told Atlantis sank, swallowed by water, destroyed in a single day and night of sorrow, lost beneath the sea. But what if that story was only the shadow of something deeper? What if Atlantis did not sink, but fade? What if the fall was not collapse, but disappearance? Not into water, but into time, into myth, into the blind spot of memory where symbols sleep and echoes wait to be heard again. Because what is water but the perfect metaphor for the unconscious? What is sinking if not the act of slipping out of waking awareness into dream? Atlantis didn't go under. It slipped away from the realm of the seen into the realm of the remembered. The disappearance was not sudden. It was gradual, subtle, like a star fading just before dawn, not extinguished, just hidden by the arrival of a denser world. We descended, not physically, but vibrationally. From a reality of harmony, clarity, crystalline thought, to a world of weight, of separation, of forgetting. And Atlantis, unable to hold itself in the thicker gravity of our descent, let go. It was not destroyed, it was veiled, not lost beneath oceans, but behind the veil we pulled over our own eyes. Because Atlantis was not just a place, it was a frequency, a tuning, a collective resonance held in balance between the mind, the heart, and the earth itself. When that balance broke, when the tuning shifted, it became unreachable. Not gone, just out of range. Like music we no longer know how to hear. And so we imagined a flood. We imagined fire and collapse and punishment. But the truth was quieter. It simply faded. And because we could no longer touch it, we convinced ourselves it never was. But memory doesn't die. It goes quiet. It waits. And sometimes in dreams, in rituals, in sacred spaces that speak in geometry and light, we feel the soft return of something we thought had been drowned. But it was never beneath the waves. It was always just behind the veil. Before the fall, before the forgetting, there was clarity. a kind of world that did not separate mind from matter, spirit from science, form from frequency. This was Atlantis, not a kingdom of marble and gold, but a civilization built on resonance. Its structures were not just stone, they were aligned with stars, with sound, with the vibrational rhythms of the planet itself. Not built, but tuned. Atlantean thought was crystalline, not in its fragility, but in its precision, its transparency. To think was to shape, to feel was to inform, to speak was to align. Language wasn't used to describe reality, it was used to structure it. Their temples hummed, not with electricity, but with geometry made alive. Crystals weren't ornaments, they were instruments, living libraries, harmonic bridges between inner and outer form. Atlantean science was not opposed to the mystical, it was mystical. Because they knew there is no separation between the measurable and the sacred. They worked with sound not as noise, but as structure. Frequencies were their tools, tonal architecture, chambers tuned not just to hold space, but to amplify consciousness. A thought held clearly enough became light. A feeling unpolluted became force. This is what we've forgotten. Not the buildings, not the tools, but the way of seeing. A kind of perception that does not divide the world into inner and outer, but experiences it as one luminous continuum, where thought is matter, and matter responds to coherence. Atlanteans did not dominate nature. They resonated with it, not to control, but to participate. They lived not as owners of the earth, but as extensions of its song. And when that song began to lose its harmony, when distortion entered the field, the clarity began to cloud. And Atlantis, unable to maintain its resonance in a world slipping into dissonance, began to fade. Not in anger, not in tragedy, but in the same way a clear note fades into silence when no one remembers how to sing along. We imagine it as thunder, as oceans rising in rage, as towers shattering beneath a furious sky. But Atlantis did not fall in a single night. It lowered, gently, quietly, like a breath that was never exhaled. It was not a cataclysm, it was a forgetting, a slow drift from clarity into confusion, from unity into division, from alignment into ambition. The fall began not with war, but with imbalance. A subtle tilt in the inner compass, a hunger to own what once was shared, a desire to manipulate what once was harmonized. Knowledge became property, power became leverage, feeling became weakness, and the crystalline mind, once clear as morning light, began to fracture. They still had the tools, the songs, the stones, but they no longer remembered how to listen. And when listening dies, so too does the frequency that holds the world together. So Atlantis dimmed, not like a flame extinguished, but like a light slowly suffocated by its own shadow. This is why no wreckage has been found, no ruins, no throne rooms drowned in salt, because the true collapse was vibrational. Atlantis did not fall into the sea, it fell into separation. Between mind and heart, between knowing and being, between the sacred and the self. And as that separation grew, the frequency that once held the Atlantean field could no longer sustain itself. It cracked, it scattered, it dissolved, not as punishment, but as inevitability. For when a system built on resonance loses its center, it cannot be forced to stand. So the Atlanteans watched, as the clarity faded, as the temples quieted, as the light between thoughts grew dim, and some wept, and some fought, and some remembered. They knew it was ending, not violently, but completely. The fall was not an explosion. It was a withdrawal. Atlantis did not sink. It stepped back from a world no longer able to carry its song. Not all stayed. As the vibration faltered, as the resonance dimmed, as the great harmony dissolved into dissonance, some heard the silence beneath the silence, and they knew it was time to leave. But they did not flee. There was no panic, no exodus of bodies rushing from burning cities, because this departure was not physical. They carried no gold, no treasures, no maps. They carried only memory, not the kind written in books, but the kind etched in light, in breath, in the blood's silent knowing. They were not survivors. They were keepers of symbols, of harmonics, of the last intact chords of a fading world. And they scattered, not to escape destruction, but to plant seeds in places where the soil of the spirit was still fertile. Egypt, Sumer, Tikal, Göbekli Tepe, the Andes, the Himalayas, and places long forgotten, buried under layers of time and amnesia. They walked quietly, some as sages, some as builders, some simply as presence. But wherever they went, they carried Atlantis with them, not as empire, but as frequency, a tone, a pattern, a way of being. They became myth, gods, demigods, watchers, feathered serpents, white-haired wanderers from the sea. Cultures remembered them not by name, but by impact, by the way their temples aligned to the stars, by the way their stones sang, by the way they taught that the soul was not inside the body, but that the body was held within the soul. These were the ones who walked away, not because they gave up, but because they understood that when a note fades from one song, it must begin again in another. So they whispered, they encoded, they hid the sigils of memory in ritual, in stone, in story, waiting, not for discovery, but for resonance, because they knew Atlantis would never rise from the ocean. It would rise from within us, when we remember what they remembered, and choose, again, to walk in tune. There are places on this earth that do not belong to time. They stand in deserts, in jungles, on mountaintops wrapped in mist, quiet, still, enduring the slow forgetting of the world. But they are not ruins. They are memory, not of civilization, but of frequency. Because some stones are not just carved, they are tuned. They hum when the wind passes. They vibrate under moonlight. They echo with tones long forgotten by the ears of modern minds. These are not temples built to worship. They are instruments, chords frozen into form, keys that open something not outside, but within. They are not reminders of gods. They are reminders of us. Before we split, before we fell into forgetting, before the vibration of being was separated into thought and body. The Great Pyramid was not built for tombs. It was never meant to house death. It was constructed, called, to house resonance. A harmonic chamber where sound, thought, and intention could rise together and touch the threshold of another world. And not only there. In Peru, in the Andes, there are doorways etched into rock that lead nowhere. And yet, people stand before them and weep. In Angkor, the stones align with the heavens, not for beauty, but to mirror the order of the stars within the body. Because these places were not simply constructed, they were anchored. Atlantean memory did not vanish. It was seated in points of power across the world. Energy nodes, vortexes, not myths, but harmonic realities that still vibrate beneath the surface. And some who visit them even today feel it. A pressure in the chest, a stirring behind the eyes, a stillness that has nothing to do with silence. They do not understand why, but the body remembers. The soul remembers. The pattern, once felt, cannot be unfelt. These are the temples that remember, not because of what's written, but because of what they hold, like bowls of stone still resonating with the last note of a vanished song. And we are drawn to them not as tourists, but as fragments trying to find our source. The Atlanteans did not pass down blueprints. They passed down geometry. They passed down form as vibration. They passed down the understanding that every shape, every angle, every alignment is a language. And if you can read it, not with the mind, but with the inner field, you will hear the message. You are not separate. You never were. There is something beneath the noise that still sings. It is not gone. It is not lost. It is waiting. In these temples, in these stones, in the body, in you. And when the tone inside you matches the tone within the stones, Atlantis is not remembered. It is returned. We search for it still. We scan the ocean floor, mapping ridges and trenches, looking for walls, roads, pillars swallowed by time. But Atlantis was never in the water, because Atlantis was never a place. It was a state of consciousness, of being, of harmony between what we think, what we feel, and what we are. It existed, yes, but not in the way we measure existence today. Not as a city, not as a continent, but as a field, a frequency of living where form and soul were not at war. Atlantis was coherence, an alignment between inner and outer worlds. When we say it disappeared, we mean that we fell out of coherence, out of balance, out of alignment with the song of the earth and the rhythm of the stars. The fall of Atlantis was not the loss of a kingdom. It was the loss of a way of seeing, a way of being, where you did not dominate nature. You listened to it. Where thought was not weaponized, it was sacred. Where technology did not enslave, it elevated, because it was built on essence, not control. Atlantis faded because we stepped away from that frequency. And the more we forgot how to feel, the more we forgot where Atlantis truly was. Inside. We carry it still. Not in DNA, not in maps, but in the deep body, in the subtle memory that stirs when you hear the right tone, or stand in a temple aligned to Orion, or dream of light that does not burn but sings. Atlantis is not behind us. It is within us and ahead of us, if we choose to remember. It does not rise through excavation. It rises when we restore the inner balance that once held it. When the mind bows to the heart, and the heart listens to the earth, and the earth aligns once more with the sky, then Atlantis is not a legend. It is a mirror of what is possible when a human being becomes whole again. It was never about the city. It was about the frequency that built it. And that frequency has never truly vanished. It only waits to be lived again. We think of fading as loss, as the final breath, as silence swallowing sound. But fading is not always a death. Sometimes it is a way of preserving, because when a thing fades gently, it leaves a trace, a softness in the field, a hum in the bones, a dream you can't quite remember but feel every time the wind changes. Atlantis faded, not to vanish, but to survive in another form. To avoid destruction, it became subtle. It withdrew from density. It stepped behind the veil, not as defeat, but as wisdom. It knew that this world would not hold its purity, not yet. So it receded, not into ocean, but into myth, into memory, into sacred architecture hidden in stone, hidden in symbols, hidden in you. This is how the old things live, not by remaining visible, but by embedding themselves where they cannot be burned or rewritten, in silence, in geometry, in breath. Atlantis, in its fading, became seed, scattered across cultures, woven into rites and rhythms, etched in the memory of initiates, buried in stories that feel like fantasy, but carry more truth than the news of today. And like all seeds, it waited for rain, for warmth, for time. This is why it stirs now, why so many are dreaming of it again, why people are feeling what they cannot name. Because the field is shifting, because the world is remembering what it once carried and what it once chose to forget. Atlantis did not end. It entered stillness. It entered us. And now, as the noise of the modern world begins to exhaust itself, we start to hear again the soft pulse beneath the chaos, the tone of the thing that never truly left. Fading is not forgetting. Fading is the act of becoming subtle enough to survive until the world is ready to hear again. And now it begins to hum, not loudly, not yet, but enough that those who remember can feel it. Like a heartbeat through stone, like music beneath silence, like a name you almost recall. Atlantis faded so that it could be reborn, not in legend, but in you. Not all things return with thunder. Some come back in whispers, in the pause between thoughts, in the feeling behind the eyes when you hear a word you haven't heard in lifetimes, but recognize instantly. This is how Atlantis returns. Not as a city, not as a structure, not even as a story, but as a frequency, a remembering. Not with facts, not with proof, but with a deep, irrational, soul-level yes. You do not rediscover Atlantis, you reattune to it. It does not rise through excavation, it rises through resonance. It returns the moment you remember what it felt like to live in alignment, to speak only truth, to think with the heart, to walk in rhythm with the earth and with the sky. When you stop asking where it was and begin to ask who you were when it was still alive, you start to hear it softly, like a tone just beneath the world, like something singing through the silence. This is the secret. Atlantis never ended. It only waits, inside you, inside the body, inside the breath between breaths. And the moment you remember, truly remember, it begins to unfold again. Not all at once, but like a light re-entering the room, it never left. And you feel it in the way your thoughts begin to soften, in the way stillness becomes a language, in the way certain symbols stir your skin, like old friends returned. When you remember, you no longer search, because you realize Atlantis was never a place you lost. It was a state you left. And now, with every breath that returns to center, with every truth spoken without armor, with every act rooted in presence, you rebuild it. Not in stone, not in myth, but in frequency. In yourself. The fall of Atlantis was never the end. It was a forgetting. And your remembering is the return. Not of a city, but of a world that lives within you. Waiting, listening, and now rising